Hey Benjamin, how you doing? It's good to finally talk to you.
Yeah, it's
Um,
been a long time coming.
so do you want to start just giving a little bit of your background? I know you said you didn't really know how you wanted to introduce yourself, but I know you're in the conscious community and you have different things going on. So
Um, sure. Yeah, my name is Benjamin Kiracofe. I have a lot of different interests and a lot of different passions, and yeah, I'm just here to have a deep, open, vulnerable conversation. I'm excited to see where it goes. Some of my passions are permaculture design, eco village development. I have a background in photography, videography, filmmaking, things like that. I was a professional musician for a number of years. Um, yeah, I very interested in philosophy, interested in um, meta-modern philosophy, interested in meta-crisis theory, meaning crisis, all of that, the liminal web, so to speak, are all things I'm really passionate about. Um, yeah, I'm passionate about spirituality. I'm passionate about yoga, meditation, health and wellness. I'm passionate about intimacy, especially conscious intimacy, tantra, things like that. Nonviolent communication, circling. These are things that I'm, interested in, and authentic relating. Um, yeah, healing modalities, body work, energy work, all that kind of stuff. So I feel like there's a lot of different directions we could take this conversation.
yeah, where are you thinking mostly? When we spoke on Messenger, you said something about like the tension between woke and anti-woke is one thing. You wanted to talk about ableism and then something to do with conscious community. I forget all the things you listed. I just looked back now before we started this to like refresh myself a little bit. But is there anywhere you want to like start and then we can bridge up from there?
Yeah, let me just take a moment to feel into it.
Sure.
and just see. And
You can
I'm
ask
curious.
me things like
What's
like
that?
like you can ask me things as well. Like you said, you had some things you might want to ask me. If you want to do that at any point, you can as well.
Yeah, that'd be great. Yeah, I kind of highlighted all of the things that are like most pretty and flashy about myself. Something that is a lot more difficult and has been a lot more difficult to experience has been over a decade of chronic illness. And yeah, I know that I had felt a desire to connect with you around that. I know you have bodily limitations of your
Hmm.
own. And yeah, I thought that we perhaps could connect about that, about our experience. Um, and yeah, just maybe see where it goes and start with that and see where
Sure,
else we
we
go.
can talk about the health. So you have chronic Lyme disease or something? I forget the nature of it. Do you want to get into chronic fatigue, some various things?
Yeah, I've been navigating chronic fatigue syndrome for at least 10 years now. I guess that's the Western medicine, that's their diagnosis of it. But it's not a very definitive diagnosis. And if you go to a doctor and get diagnosed with chronic fatigue syndrome, they usually try to put you on antidepressants, or they tell you they have no idea what to do for you.
Hmm.
And that's how it started 10 years ago. Was I was actually incredibly fit, strong and healthy. I was, a musician. I was playing lots of shows. I was pedicabbing, which is actually the bicycle taxi. I don't know if you're familiar with that. But
Hmm.
I was doing bicycle taxi in Austin, Texas, which is where I lived for about 8 years. And yeah, it just kind of hit me out of nowhere. And I was eating really healthy. I was taking good care of myself. And I was working out one day and I got up from the weight bench and I almost passed out. And at that moment, I knew something was seriously wrong. And my health just continued to decline quite a bit after that. Um, I actually did have lymphoma as well in my early 20s. I had Burkitt's lymphoma.
Hmm.
But after a lot of chemotherapy and treatments, I started to feel a lot better. And there was about 3 or 4 years where I was feeling really great. Um, and so, yeah, to have my health taken away from me like that was incredibly, incredibly difficult. Um, I've, I mean, I've been bedridden up to 6 months at a time. I've experienced, incredibly, incredibly torturous, very, very torturous things. For the last 4 years, I've had difficulty walking. I've got a lot of issues with my legs and weakness in my legs. That's likely related to mold, mycotoxin illness, and late stage Lyme. Again, these things are highly debatable. This is the diagnosis that I get through functional medicine testing and integrative medicine, which is kind of a
Hmm.
hybrid between Western medicine and naturopaths and more,
Hmm.
you know, again, there's, I've spent, like a decade researching all of this stuff, and it's crazy. The the information ecology is wild out there for medicine and for everything. You know what I mean? Like there's polarizing viewpoints everywhere. And so there's, a certain sector of folks that would say late stage Lyme isn't even a possible thing, although it actually just recently got accepted as a diagnosis by the CDC, which is exciting.
Hmm.
Of course, there's an entire sector that doesn't believe a single thing the CDC says. So it's the whole making sense of the whole thing has been pretty maddening. But anyhow, returning it back to my personal experience, yeah, I started having really severe gut issues, IBD, irritable bowel disease, colitis, SIBO, small intestine bacterial overgrowth. Uh, other things I deal with: fibromyalgia, mast cell activation syndrome, POTS, which is a
Hmm.
really interesting thing.
Yeah, like basically stand up tachycardia. Basically, when you're transitioning positions, you have increased heart rate, right?
Yeah, increased heart rate, dizziness, fatigue, lightheadedness, things like that. Uh,
Hmm.
yeah, it's like a blood flow disorder. Uh, what I'm
Yeah.
what I'm learning though is that at least in my case, most or not, if not all of these diagnoses are a result of mold mycotoxin poisoning and late stage Lyme. Because I lived in a lot of very moldy homes growing up, and had some pretty severe mold exposure. And the most recent home that I purchased here outside of Asheville, I lived in for 3 years, and I dealt with some pretty bad molds there in the basement. Ended up getting a lot worse and got very sick. And so I've since moved, and I also had the home totally remediated, which is good. And I still think it's better than most homes around here. For most people, I live in Asheville, which is a temperate rainforest. It's very humid. There's lots of rainfall, and so folks deal with a lot of mold around here in the houses. That's a whole nother deep. I could talk about that for a long time because I've spent hours and hours and hours researching mold and building biology and architecture and how homes get moldy and how they get toxic, how to actually properly remediate them. Most people go about remediating them in ways that are not proper. Um, but anyways, yeah, so I've since moved out of that home, and I've actually been improving quite a bit, which is amazing. Um, but yeah, so that's a brief background on the health stuff that I've been experiencing. There's a whole long list of symptoms that I just don't even feel like listing. But
Yeah.
I mean, in short, like, yeah, debilitating fatigue, chronic dehydration, very bad headaches pretty much every day, muscle weakness, insomnia at times. That's absolutely torturous. Um, and so it's been really interesting for me being a part of, the so-called conscious community, the health and wellness community, and which is full of mostly very healthy people. And it's been really odd for me to be kind of an outsider, in the sense that I don't have the same ability in my body as most of those folks. Even though I take incredibly good care of myself, I eat a really great diet. I'm drugs and alcohol free, refined sugar free, caffeine free, all the things. And do yoga, meditation, cold plunge, sauna, all the biohacking stuff. It's like that's my entire life. Um, and yet I still deal with really great limitations, and it's been really tough to navigate that. So yeah, and I'm curious to know what's your experience in your body, what limitations are you experiencing, and yeah, how have you been interacting socially? How's that been feeling?
So I was born with cerebral palsy. To be more specific, the way it affects me, spastic triplegia, which means that I have this spastic dominant form of CP where it's based on muscle stiffness and tightness and low muscle tone. Um, and the triplegia element means that I I basically can only use like one limb properly, and the other three are significantly hindered. Um, so yeah, I can use my right arm, but my left arm's messed up, and my legs, and I can only walk. Like when I was a kid, I could basically um, walk on my own if I was holding on to things or using a walker, or even I could I could walk until maybe I could walk maybe 40 feet and then I need to grab onto something. But then as you grow, and then after I hit puberty, and basically your your muscles can't keep up with the rate of your bone growth, and things get tighter, and you lose abilities. I had a surgery when I was 16, which triggered a very rare vascular gastrointestinal condition called superior mesenteric artery syndrome, um, which is um, which is basically an obstruction of the duodenum by the overlaying superior mesenteric artery. So the superior mesenteric artery um, is basically like it descends from the aorta, and it crosses over the duodenum, which is this like the part that attaches the small intestine and the stomach, and basically the fat between the two gets compromised, and then the superior mesenteric artery wraps around the duodenum and chokes it off, so food can't pass through. And then as a result, there's like only one way for decompression. Like if you eat anything, you vomit everything up. There's nowhere for it to go. So I went down to like 55 or 54 pounds. I was like the lowest weight for my age, height, and sex that was recorded to like still be alive since something like the Holocaust or something like that. It was is most people die way before they get that light, and then they gave me an NG tube, which is a feeding tube through the nose. Um, I was 16 around this time. It was right after I had an orthopedic surgery, so I was still in cast up to my hips almost, not quite, but just below my upper thighs, and they put a feeding tube in, and they try to move it past the obstruction somehow, and then get food in through that way. But then the obstruction was so tight, it kept kinking, and then shooting the food upwards or shooting it the wrong direction, and it wasn't going anywhere. So they tried re-putting it in a couple times. It didn't work, and then they considered inserting a surgically inserting a G tube below, um, and but then I basically said I don't know if I'm willing to do that because the risk of me dying, because I was so low weight already, and my hemoglobin at the time was extremely low. So they said I'd probably die from exsanguination or infection after the fact. So I never did that. They said I had like about 2 or 3 weeks to live or so based on the current state I was in, but I had already shown marginal improvement. I like was gaining I gained 5 or 10 pounds maybe in a short period. I was smoking um, marijuana medicinally to increase the appetite and slowly stretching my stomach, or stretching the obstruction between my stomach and the small intestine. But I was still vomiting maybe 50% of my meals up, and then slowly but surely, um, I guess, um, after having enough time to recover from my initial surgery, which was on my legs, that triggered it. They don't know if it was pharmacological something when I was under anesthesia that caused it, or just being in the supine position on my back for a long time. They say that people who are already thin, I was already on the thinner side, are more prone if they don't eat for a long period and then they do a surgery and then they're on their back a long time. Um, but it's a very rare condition. At the time, there was only like 500 documented cases of superior mesenteric artery syndrome. Um, so um, now there's more like thousands because it's more recognized, I guess. Um, but it's still quite rare. And then I basically got better over that. I gained weight. It took me years to get to like 100 pounds, and then now I'm at 130, 140, whatever I'm at. But it took me a couple of years to get to 80, then so on and so forth. Anyway, after going through all that kind of medical issue, I was basically healthy more or less from a physical standpoint, other than having CP and not being able to move around and having some leftover digestive issues, more chronic, less acute. So it wasn't acute. I wasn't vomiting all the time. I wasn't ill. I wasn't in a hospital, but I would have chronic digestive issues, basically gastroparesis, which is like slow digestion, partially paralyzed gut. Basically, it's just not moving. The food is not moving through as fast, so still vomiting sometimes, but not too often. And then it slowly got better, and then it just now I very rarely vomit. I just bloat, um, or will have low appetite sometimes. Um, and during the whole time I was going through this, I was very stoic and brave, and it was very tough. But then I'd say probably, like, I guess 2 years after I recovered to a point I was healthy enough that I wasn't like dying, I started to develop pretty severe hypochondria and anxiety in general, but mostly related to health and illness and whatnot. And I had to stop smoking weed after greening out a few times, having really severe depersonalization, uh,
Uh-huh.
derealization. Never had any psychosis or anything like that, but I thought I was gonna have psychosis. That was my fear, so I stopped. It was very disturbing derealization.
Mm,
Um,
actually
Things
makes sense.
didn't feel real around me, or I felt like I didn't have control over myself. I was in a dream, having panic attacks even after I basically stopped. Um, using marijuana at all, and I was using it mostly medicinally, but I would get carried away and use it recreationally too with friends sometimes, because they would come over and I'd want to eat and they'd want to smoke with me, and it was all fun, and then I kind of got through that period okay. Kind of the panic attacks kind of went down for a while. My anxiety went down. Uh, then it took me a few years to get my life in order. Then I went to university part time for like a year and a half, but then I was having some family issues as well, not so related to my health, just other things. And then the pandemic happened, um, and then I started to live an increasingly sedentary lifestyle. So even though my health was good, um, until then, or at least very much improving, um, then I wasn't getting enough exercise. I would start to experience increasing like episodes of like sinus tachycardia, inappropriate sinus tachycardia, which is where your heart just randomly speeds up. And I was having labile hypertension episodes where my blood pressure, even though I'm normotensive, most of the time it would just skyrocket when I would be anxious, and having severe sleep issues, insomnia. And then I ended up doing a sleep study, found out I had sleep apnea, but because of my uh, gastric kind of issues, CPAP isn't really the best option for me because you're basically swallowing air all the time when you're doing that, and that can make my stomach upset. So it's been navigating around that and just dealing with life. And to get more on the social part, spending probably, yeah, I'm basically home 5 days a week. Then I go out on weekends to the pub with my dad to see people. But other than that, unless I have like a special outing, like a concert, or I have a doctor's appointment to go to or something else like that, my social life is very limited. So I've been very restricted to online, and it's there's stigma related to just being visibly physically disabled. It's not like I can hide it in any situations and then open up about my health conditions later. It kind of, some things obviously I can hide, like the ones that aren't obvious, but the main issue I have, cerebral palsy, is very visible and physical, so I can't change that. And just having to navigate through that can be really challenging. But that's basically been my journey, and it's affected me in to some extent making friends, but not too much. It's just me not being able to go out enough. But the area where it's affected me most is sexual or romantic relationships, because there's a lot of stigma around that, and obviously there's evolutionary reasons on top of that why people might not be that interested in a disabled person, and so many factors. But that's basically my whole story. And also trying to like find care and being able to afford it, and worrying about how to make a living once my parents are gone, and if I don't have the right support systems in place. And yeah, it's very complex mess, but that's basically my journey. And I just wanted to contribute to a space where I could have intellectual conversations with interesting people and solve like big world problems, not limited to disability, but disability included.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing.
So yeah, I I'm interested on what you think in terms of, because you have some conditions that are quite complex. They might have several different etiologies, and you don't really know what the causes are for sure in some of these cases, and how we can use like functional medicine, or like maybe a systems medicine approach, kind of framework to how do you think we can get, I guess, the medical system to start thinking in a more holistic way and not so reductionistic, or having more individualized like patient kind of metrics, instead of just treating everything more or less the same if they don't know what to do with someone? Because I found that really hard, especially when it came to things like in sleep medicine, or even cardiovascular stuff, because I didn't have a severe enough cardiovascular problem to be put on like medications. But it was recommended I did CPAP, and I'm taking supplements like magnesium glycinate, and I'm trying to do all the proper like natural stuff. But sometimes there's not enough information for people out there, or there's not enough access to, I guess, interdisciplinary teams of medical professionals. So, what do you think the best way to navigate that is in our current society, based on your own experience?
Yeah, so bridging like bridging the different worlds, the different worldviews. You mean like Western allopathic medicine and bridging that
Yeah,
with
alternative forms, whether Eastern or
yeah.
whatever. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, well, yeah, I would love to see hospitals change completely. I envision I envision this is well, this won't be the most practical for all cases, and I still think hospitals should for sure exist. There's a lot of it has a very strong, use case in many different circumstances, especially
Mhm.
like short-term acute illnesses and
Yeah.
acute physical serious injuries, things like that. Hospitals are amazing. But having spent a lot of time in hospitals back when I had lymphoma, it did not feel like a healing place to me whatsoever. And so I would love for there to be, again, this is going to sound maybe like a bit of a pipe dream, but I would love for there to be live-in residential communities that are holistically focused on health specifically, so that folks with chronic illness and disabilities and whatnot could go live in like a regenerative eco-village type environment that has little tiny homes or whatever for people to stay in, and then there's central healing facilities which would have um, Western medicine doctors, integrative doctors, which is the kind of in between, functional medicine doctors, Eastern medicine, Chinese traditional medicine. I mean, there's Tibetan medicine, there's all sorts of different kinds. There's shamanic medicines, right? There's so many different healing modalities that can come together. And I would love to see that synergize in a place like that. Um, of course, all of these different viewpoints, like the folks would have to be able to handle all of the dialectical tension. And, to quote Verbeke, they'd have to get really good at opponent processing, and they'd have to be able to have conversations around what's the signal, what's the noise, what are, that kind of stuff. Like what is, and try to bridge the divide, because there is a huge gap amongst all of these different modalities, but there's also a lot of synthesis that I believe that can occur as well. And that's not going to happen when they're all siloed in their own, you know, echo chambers, right? And so imagine having an institution where you have folks from all of these different modalities coming together as a group to try to work to to help people in need. And again, that's, I'm sure it sounds idealistic, and there's lots of different issues that could come up in that type of model. But yeah, I have quite a few friends with chronic illness of all different kinds, and they tend to find themselves in very difficult positions, isolated, having a hard time making money financially, having a hard time socially. And I'm wondering how that idea lands for you, like a place that it could be covered by insurance, it could be covered by, it could be supplemented by nonprofits. Uh, there's different revenue stream options, I think, but yeah.
Yeah, I haven't thought of like a organized, structured way of like the economics of it, or insurance or things like that. I'll just say, uh, in Canada, I'm quite lucky that we have basically universal health coverage for basically any important medical issue you could have. Everything's covered, and although pharmaceuticals are not covered. And in terms of having actual spaces where you can go or having care, that's not really covered unless you're institutionalized and you cannot care for yourself at all. So so um, yeah, I think there needs to be an alternatives to people going into long-term care homes, especially when they're younger. And I know there's ones geared for younger people, but it can be feel very like overly clinicalized, and I think on a more cultural basis, there's an answer to it without basically building intentional communities that have um, space or the intention of including or integrating disabled populations into them. Maybe not exclusively disabled people, because you want an intentional community of all kinds of people, but you have one that is truly accessible and maybe has people there who are dedicated to roles, for people like me that need care for 80% of daily living, whether it's like toileting or dressing or taking a bath. If we have intentional communities where maybe people are assigned different roles, to take care of the disabled, the elderly, and small children, etc., then you have that, and then you have everything else you would have in any other intentional community, whether it's like a um, I don't know, you have your music, you have your shaman, you have your rituals, you have whatever binds the group together, and you have um, maybe builders that are building different cabins, and you have maintenance, and you have a doctor there, or you have a nurse practitioner, or you have a naturopath, or whatever. You have different people in different roles in intentional community of teacher, musician, whatever, and you people, um, you could have it designed around like some eco village, and basically people are farming their own stuff, or there's different ways of doing that. You would have more of an insight on how to do that than me. So I've always been interested in intentional communities, but never having firsthand experience with any of it, just seeing it on the internet and seeing different variations of how it can be done, and but having very little firsthand experience, basically just being somebody who's at home, who's experienced the world in very many different ways, but mostly it's been sadly through a cyberspace. So I haven't seen everything firsthand, but I would like to see more of that. And I've definitely traveled and seen some things, although I've never actually been in any intentional well, maybe I visited one as a small child, actually, but other than one exposure, I haven't really seen much of it. But I've always been super fascinated how we can basically start new cultures, and subcultures that can birth, I guess, new ways of treating people and better ideas of how to make society work, and then slowly build up, um, and make it more normalized as much as we can. That's why I'm very interested in the game B space and various things like that. It's because uh, they're trying to do stuff along those lines.
Yeah. Yeah. I love your idea of being a part of a community, an intentional community where folks who have disability or are less able or chronic illness or bodily limitations, where they can be supported. And I think that's amazing. I think that's one of the big failures of modernity in our current siloed way of living, where we've lost connection to community, we've lost connection to the village. That's where we came from. As a human species, we came from village life, and uh, you know, even the hunter gatherer nomadic tribes. I mean, there's um, they I forgot exactly which. I mean, I read an article where they would where it was indicative that these folks were caring for their sick or their injured back in very, very early times. I'm not sure exactly when. I'm not an archaeologist. That'd be something to ask like Michael Garfield or something. But
Yeah,
we've been taking care of our weakest links for since the beginning of humanity. So that's kind of where I'm going with that. And again, it's hard. I don't know if that lands. If that probably the word weakest link doesn't land. I don't know how that lands for you. It doesn't land great for
no,
me either. But
I don't find it offensive or
you don't find
anything.
it offensive. Yeah.
Not me. I'm not somebody that really obsesses over language. I'm more focused on intent, and I think
I like that.
just as a descriptive matter, it is often the weakest link. It does not mean that the disabled person or whatever the case may be doesn't have something of value to to that tribe or to that group, or because they could be the sage in that
Right.
environment. They could be the elder philosopher that helps them, or they might be the storyteller, or they might have a crucial role in the tribe, but they're obviously not doing the hunting or the gathering. They're not doing that work, but they could still have some utility to the group. It doesn't mean um, they're useless. They could be in some cases, but in those cases, I still think it's the human and decent thing to care for somebody. You don't just care for people just because of their utility, but
Of
hopefully,
course.
yeah. So I don't find the weakest link thing offensive though. I think the notion of survival of the fittest sometimes is like really wrong headed, and I think like a lot of people, the fittest strategy was often survival of the friendliest, and cooperating and working together. So it's not always leave the weakest behind. I'm sure many hunter gatherers did that, and many others did not do that. So there was different competing evolutionary strategies, and certain ones um, won over or became more popular, but that doesn't mean that was the only way of existing. And I think the lie of modernity a lot of time is that I'm just a product of modernity, and I should be thankful that I live today, because if I didn't live today, oh, they would have just left me behind. Where like you said, there's evidence that in many cases that wasn't the case, and we were actually more in touch with treating the disabled better. Obviously, we didn't have as much of the tech to help them, and we're in a better time in many ways. But as Daniel Schmachtenberger always talks about, the naive progress narrative, I think there is an element of where I've gotten this attitude from at least some subset of people, like, hey, this is still like the best time for disabled people. Like, can like come on, like you, they basically saying, oh, you're just a product of modernity. You're not a natural phenomenon because you would have died off. Like this is just the compassion of like a progressive society, and like basically you have no use, and fuck
It's kind of
off.
a natural selection theory. Yeah.
Yeah, I've kind of felt that. It's not always explicit, but I'm saying I feel that in undertones of people's attitudes sometimes. Like, um, so I don't know what you think about that, but yeah, I think obviously there's many benefits to modernity, but I think we have to get past it, and postmodernism has issues too, and that's why I like metamodernism, but there's so many different takes on it, and I'm not quite sure I fully understand how it exactly works, but I'm trying to learn as much as I can and form a new way of thinking that isn't held hostage to old ways of thinking that either didn't work or worked but only worked for a short period of time, and now we need to find new and better ways for things to work. So,
Yeah. The I mean, I had Burkitt's lymphoma at 21, and the only reason I'm still alive is because of chemotherapy. So
mhm. And I could say the same about many things. And my dad had colon cancer, so yeah.
yeah, it's yeah, sometimes I rail on Western medicine and modernity and all of that, but and I'm grateful to still be here. Um,
Of course.
yeah, even if I struggle a lot and suffer a lot, um, it might not be so obvious, through video and through the way I look, and it's not. It's easier for me to hide. And you've mentioned, a bit how yours is not possible to hide physically, but mine's easier
For
to hide.
me, that wasn't to that wasn't to denigrate people with invisible
Oh, of
disabilities. To
course.
yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
I wasn't trying to do that.
Oh, yeah. No, I didn't. take it that way.
Mhm.
Yeah, where did you kind of leave off with that? Where were you gonna head?
Oh, sorry, we were talking intentional communities, and
Mm.
then the pros and cons of modernity. I can't remember the exact point we left off on, but
I think we're both interested in game B, um, and I'm sure you're familiar with game theory,
yeah,
which
like
find really
yeah,
interesting. And I think that's one thing that really sets intentional communities apart, is that in order for them to function well, they're attempting to operate out of a game theoretic framework, and they're trying to move towards
win
omni-win
win.
win-win solutions. Yeah, and so
Yeah.
sociocracy is a really interesting um, modality for that. I don't know if you're familiar with sociocracy.
No, I'm not. I'm familiar with game theory, but not sociocracy particularly. Maybe if you like explain it, maybe I am, and I just forget. But you can expand on it, and I'll see if I know what you're talking about.
Sure. Yeah, sociocracy, and I'm not an expert here in this, and it's actually something I want to start practicing, and I've been learning a lot about it, but I'm not currently in a team or a community that I can practice it in. But I would like to. um, but yeah, it's a decision making framework where you um, you have different there's different teams, so there's different circles, and in each circle you have a leader, um, and those leaders will come together and they'll have something called rounds where if they're trying to make a decision around something, the goal is actually um, to vote, but it's not to have consensus where everyone has to be a yes. The goal is to actually have everyone be a yes or within their window of tolerance, which I find really awesome. And so there's this saying where it's like it's good, it's safe enough to try and good enough for now, or something like that. And so what I really like about it is, unless if somebody's a hard no to move forward with something, then that can halt the process, and then you can make rounds and you can kind of provide your reasoning and stuff for wanting a certain decision. But ultimately, it's not for everyone to be a full yes. It's that you have to at least just be within a window of tolerance, which I think is a really nice way to like get a group of people to have something like consensus without it being 100% consensus like other
So
modalities, which
this is
I
like a
really find
post
possible.
democracy kind of framework, you would say, where
Yeah,
it's it's instead of having a binary choice of yes or no,
exactly.
you're having a added choice that is essentially a yes, but it's a temporary yes. It's like a maybe sort of thing. I'm on board with trying, but how do you distinguish a yes from a maybe in that system? Just out of curiosity, I'm not giving like pushback because I don't agree. I'm just wondering like how does it actually function?
Um, I think that's where the good enough to try, safe enough for now comes in, and it also your your one thing that helps to get people's individual egos out of the way is you can compare sort of the quandary at hand or the decision at hand to the mission statement overall for either that particular circle or for the entire organization. And so since you're comparing it to you're reflecting on the mission statement, you're saying, hey, does this actualize the goals of the mission statement or not? And is it safe enough to try? Is it good enough for now? Is it within the window of tolerance? Can we experiment here? Also, does it cause any direct harm or not? And if it doesn't cause any direct harm, uh, then again, it's sort of in that window of tolerance.
Yeah, and we would also have to take in account like hazards too, not just danger, right? Like when we're measuring risk of harm.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, that sounds. That sounds like a reasonable. Yeah, I like that. So that's called. Well, what did you call
Sociocracy.
that again?
Sociocracy. Yeah, there's
Sociology.
probably there's plenty of people that would probably do a better job explaining it, especially if they've had a lot of real world experience doing it on a team, which I don't have yet. So I did the best I could, and yeah, I'm sure there's probably some gaps to fill. But yeah.
That's cool. Um, so where would you like to take the conversation next? What are you most interested in right now, or what do you think the most concerning things are in society right now, and how do you think we can fix those things?
Hmm. I mean,
Oh,
there's a
it's
lot.
loaded.
What's that?
And I know that's a very big question, but
Yeah, I mean, it's so loaded.
yeah.
I mean, we could start going down the road of metacrisis theory and all of that. Although, I mean, yeah, that could be fun. Your listeners could definitely just listen to like 20 hours of Daniel Smachtenberger if they want, or, you know, Jonathan Rosen, or any of these guys, Nate Hagens. It's like this, these are all, you know, all the folks that I've listened to a bunch, and we can certainly talk about all that stuff. Yeah. Uh, I'm passionate about. I'm currently selling my home, and I'm considering actually co-creating a community of folks that are dedicated to healing, to health and wellness, to permaculture, to co-creating community. That's where the sociocracy piece comes in for me. I've got uh, a man I'm working with to mentor me around that, who's already done a lot of it and is, you know, very familiar with piecing together communities from the ground up. You know, and I've studied eco village development and residential development. I'm familiar with the process of how to do it. So to kind of tie it in, though, I do think the world needs to be returning to the village, returning to community, returning to local, um, returning specifically to something I would call regenerative practices. And so that's something I learned about in permaculture design, and it kind of ties in with General Schmachtenberger, which is when you consider all of the inputs and the outputs of a community and all of the different sectors of living, uh, are is this actually a net positive contribution to the world when considering the inputs and the outputs and the externalities and the second and third and fourth order effects and all of that, all the downstream effects? When considering all of this, is there a net positive regenerative impact on Mother Nature, on the earth, on ourselves, our bodies, on our communities and our relationships, on our future generations? What's the
Mm-hmm.
impact? A lot of times in modernity and late stage capitalism, we see net negative, extractive impacts on our ecosystem, on society. There'll be people that want to debate that and say things have progressively gotten better and better and better. And there's a lot of folks that are, I would say, techno optimists that believe that technology is going to get us out of all of the problems of the meta crisis. And that's, I like to try to consider both stances, and I've been, you know, researching some of that as well. I think there's some truth to it, and I think on the whole, I lean towards the meta crisis. You know, Daniel Schmachtenberger kind of sounding the
Yeah,
alarm. I lean more towards that.
me as
Um,
well.
yeah, but I also think there's some room for techno optimism for sure. Although, you know, again, most of the solutions here, here's how here's my stance on that. I believe that as long as we can learn how to evolve technology to be more regenerative, to be more organic, to be things like organic biodegradable batteries and things like that,
Mm-hmm.
because there's this thing that happens that the more we scale technology and evolve technology, it requires more and more technology to keep it going indefinitely. It requires more mining, it requires more power, more resources, more infrastructure, more supply chain, etc. You know, and you can't do that on a finite planet. You can't have parabolic infinite growth on a finite planet. It just doesn't work in terms of power and resources. And so if we can come up with some truly regenerative, sustainable energy, that will really help post oil post coal, that will be very important. If we can do it and actually sustain it and regenerate it, that'll be one of the biggest um, things that we can that we can do,
Hmm.
especially if our entire economy runs on it, our entire infrastructure runs on it. We need to evolve agriculture for sure. The industrial monocropping, chemical-based agriculture that's destroying the topsoil, that's a big issue that we need to address. I think studying permaculture design, things like food forests are really appealing to me, as well as adapting neighborhoods, like retrofitting neighborhoods to be sustainable and regenerative. Lots of backyard gardens, say like a um, a neighborhood food forest, tool sharing, things like that. I mean, solar potentially. I'm not sure. I'd have to do more research into it to see how actually net positive and regenerative it is. I'm not sure we have any super good solutions for power. And I don't know if you know.
What
I mean,
about
geothermal is decent, but and actually nuclear could be
yeah,
good.
that's what I was going to say. What do you think about nuclear at scale, at least? Like, not so much for smaller communities because they might either use that or have their own alternative. But um, I'm sure you imagine cities still existing in this world, just more and more smaller communities, but there will still be some cities. And
Yeah.
I think in that world, we would probably need nuclear or something like it, or
Yeah.
unless we achieve like fusion or something that even takes nuclear to like another level, then that would be even better. But
I think that would be that. That's sort of like, yeah, definitely a really big goal. Um, yeah, I think like clean nuclear fusion energy that's regenerative. Yeah, that would be great. Cities, I mean, cities are pretty unsustainable and non-regenerative currently. They might be able to be adapted and retrofitted to a certain degree. I think we might, I don't know if we're going to see, we might start to see some decline in the growth of cities. There's a lot of, I mean, folks are going out into suburban and rural environments a lot more, especially with the internet and being able to work remotely. Um, I know that personally I did that, and I've got a lot of friends that post COVID, since they were able to work remote, they've just wanted to live more rurally, more connected to nature, and actually getting away from cities. Um, yeah,
yeah, well, I would say living in a more rural area, insofar you have a community, is better. But if you don't have a
yeah,
community, then
it's
it can be much more isolating, right? Because
yeah, I've experienced that.
I
Yeah,
live on like 11 acres. I'm north of Toronto by like an hour, so like I'm out in the middle of nowhere. I know what rural is like, but if you don't have a community, I think more people should live in rural areas. But I wouldn't want to remove working or visiting in cities.
oh,
For
yeah.
every, I mean, cities have to become better, and I don't agree that they should infinitely grow. I think that kind of growth is the problem. But if we can make cities actually functional and have a purpose and have them environmentally friendly enough to exist and not destructive in other ways, I think cities do have a place in the world. I just think we need to increasingly move towards more smaller intentional communities like we were discussing.
Yeah, and then in cities as they are currently rely on what, like an 8 continent supply chain or something. That's
Mhm.
one of the issues. And then also most cities aren't growing their food. They import the food from, California and Mexico, at least in the US. And
Mhm.
and so yeah, having more farms and again, farmland takes up a lot of space, but that's conventional monocropping, chemical industrial agriculture takes up a lot of space. It'd be really interesting to see what kind of permaculture, guild cropping, food forest type solutions we could implement to cities, both like rooftop gardens, things like that, aquaponics, and then but like outside of the city, could we have farms that utilize their acreage a lot more efficiently and actually supply cities with locally grown produce? And that would cut down a lot on carbon emissions. So much carbon emissions is the supply chain, is the airplanes and the trucks and everything that are carting around to the cities, everything that it takes to live. And so, yeah, and then folks just creating more of their own things. And again, it's all kind of idealistic for me because I'm not currently living it, although I know folks who are and I have friends who are, and I would like to. I'm moving in that direction. But I do support local. I buy local. I buy things on Etsy, buy things at the farmers market, buy things from friends. Try to reuse, recycle, repurpose, that kind of stuff. These are all important things that humanity ought to be doing more of.
Yeah, circling back to, because I'm curious about it. I was thinking about it as you were talking about when you're talking about your health issues and mold, and you did lots of research on mold. I was curious what your findings were on that, or what some of your knowledge is on that, because it's something I often hear a little bit about, but I don't really get much into like a deep dive about that, or could you get into that a little bit? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. What specifically, like mold, mycotoxin illness,
Yeah,
and
mold microtoxin stuff. Just what you learned in like I don't know how it affects health.
sure.
Maybe antifungal stuff you've tried. I don't know. I was just thinking of somewhere to take it next. Yeah.
Sure. Um, yeah, let me think. Okay. So, yeah, a big question that I had at first, and why I didn't think mold could really be a thing for me, was because a lot of my friends were living in moldy homes and they weren't sick, and I was living in moldy homes, with other people who didn't get sick. And so I was really curious about what the reasoning behind that is. Um, I guess it's two gene variations specifically that tend to cause issues for people. One is the MTHFR gene. I believe it's kind of jokingly known as the motherfucker gene. But yeah, it's like MTHFR. It's a gene variation that makes methylation difficult, and detoxing mycotoxins difficult. There's another gene called HLA-DR, and I have both of these variants. And so yeah, what happens is the mold mycotoxins, which are able to be metabolized and detoxed and excreted by most normal people, in some folks it's very difficult, and so it just builds up in the system. It builds up in the liver and in the gallbladder, and then there's some mechanism where like it tries to leave through the intestines and the colon, but it can't, and then it gets like recycled back into the body. I think also it can cause inflammation in the gut and the intestines. It can contribute to leaky gut syndrome, which is like gaps in
Mm-hmm.
the junctions in the wall of the intestines, and that can actually then kind of recirculate the mycotoxins as well as any other toxins in the system, which can actually lead into autoimmune conditions as well, which is something that I
Yeah.
have to deal with, as well as systemic inflammation. And so that's kind of some of the mechanisms behind something called CIRS, like CIRS, chronic inflammatory response syndrome. I believe that was founded by Shoemaker, discovered by
Okay.
Shoemaker. I forgot his first name, but Dr. Shoemaker. Yeah, and I've been reading this book called Toxic, and learning a lot through that, learning a lot through just the internet and research through ChatGPT. ChatGPT actually has a huge amount of information on mold mycotoxin illness and late stage Lyme, surprisingly, because sorry, Chat GPT tends to lean like very, very Western allopathic medicine, like in very kind of strictly, um, and there is some debate in that world around these things. There's not a lot of understanding of it. There's not very many doctors that really get this particular condition, and
Hmm.
so it's been really tough to kind of feel at times gaslit by those doctors who will say it's all in my head and my lab tests look fine, and you know even though some of my labs are ridiculous, like it's called a TGF beta 1 or something, was like through the roof, and that's like a chronic inflammatory marker, and I've had that like at very, very high levels. um, so anyways, that's some of the like physiological stuff. Structurally in homes, mold is actually a huge issue across the entire country. I think, I'm not sure the exact number, but it's like 70% of homes deal with some degree of mold issue. And honestly, I think it's higher than that, especially in regions like this. Um, I've
Where
spent
are you
more.
located right now? But North Carolina, you said.
Yeah, Asheville, North Carolina.
Okay,
Yeah, it's a temperate
keep going.
rainforest. It's
Yeah.
what's that?
Keep going. Sorry, I just couldn't remember. Okay, good.
Yeah, so mold is a massive issue here, and people are not building mold resistant homes at all. Matter of fact, so a large amount of new build homes actually have mold issues. There's mold in the lumber, in the 2x4s that they frame the homes with. A lot of the times the lumber is moldy. Um, Drywall is like an awful material that gets moldy really easily. Anytime that there's any leaks whatsoever in the bathroom, like in the shower, like in the plumbing, any time that there's leaks. And interesting, I'm part of all these groups and I'm seeing all these stories. Like people will have a new home being built, and the contractor will be, building out the bathroom and whatnot, and they'll show photos of like the backer board behind the tiles and the caulking, with like when they're installing everything, and it won't actually be done in a way that is going to waterproof the the the
Hmm.
um the tub in the shower and everything, and so it's just like a mold disaster waiting to happen. And it, there's just so many homes that have mold issues, especially if they don't use dehumidifiers. You're supposed to keep the humidity level of the house below 60%. It's even better if it's below 50%. Most people don't do that. Um, Basements are really prone to mold. Crawl spaces are really prone to mold. And a lot of houses actually have crawl spaces with, they put the air handler for the HVAC in the crawl space. And the air handler is like the lungs of the house. It's what draws, the air in and then puts it through the system and circulates it through the house. And a lot of times, if they're put in moldy basements or moldy crawl spaces, it's just circulating mold throughout the house. And so that was one of the issues at my place. I lived about a half an hour outside Asheville in a rural small mountain town for a couple of years. And the basement of my house had a bunch of mold on the drywall, and also some black mold in the utility closet where the air handler was. And I didn't know. And so, yeah, one of the things that was happening was the air handler was just circulating the mold mycotoxins throughout the whole house anytime I used it. And so I just kept
Hmm.
getting sicker and sicker and sicker there.
Do you know
Um,
anything about? Sorry, you were gonna say something.
all right, and I was just going to say, and I've been tested for the mycotoxins, and there's a couple of them. Ochratoxin A especially is just really high, and there's a few others that are really high.
Yeah. Do you know anything about other environmental talking for an example like paint? Paint can be an
PRCs, yeah.
issue for some people, and especially lead based paints. But I know they're trying to reduce that anyway. But I've heard of like the knock on effects of that historically. And is there anything else you looked into when you were researching like the possible different like causes of your complex like kind of unknown conditions, like what the fundamental causes were?
Well, the kind of gambit that most functional medicine doctors will run you through is um, testing for things like parasites, stool sample testing for, you know, microbial
Yeah.
imbalances. Um, that's always a big one. I don't actually test very high for parasites at all. Heavy metals is another one. I'm actually going to do some heavy metal testing soon. But that's one that most
Mhm.
functional medicine doctors will test you for. And yeah, Epstein Barr is another one. Have that. Lyme, all the co-infections. I've got that. And mold. I mean, these are the big heavy hitters. Like when I'm reading this book, it's Neil Nathan, I believe, Toxic. The book Toxic. He specifically is his whole practice has been treating folks with chronic fatigue syndrome and this kind of like mystery illness situation, which is what I have. you know, where, which, as I said, you go to a normal doctor and they're just like, yeah, you have chronic fatigue syndrome, maybe some autoimmune stuff. Like, we can't do anything for you. It's crazy. But that's been his whole world. And he said, something like 80% of patients with chronic fatigue syndrome test high for mold mycotoxins, and then I think it's 30 to 40 or maybe 50 for Lyme. And the Lyme disease is definitely an epidemic that most folks have. It's kind of like Epstein Barr. People have Lyme as Epstein Barr, but it's incredibly prevalent. It's getting more and more so. And again, not everybody reacts to it and not everybody gets sick from it. And so the theory of my current doctor, I've worked with so many, but is that mold mycotoxins, have been really weakening my system for a long time, which then has made me more susceptible to Lyme, which is why it's gotten really bad in my system, and neurological Lyme and all of that.
Hmm. And I have a question regarding, because you mentioned ChatGPT, and that made me think about a part of the conversation I was having with Robert, when we were debating whether, like, because he seems more techno optimist, I'm more techno pessimist, but
Mm.
I don't really fall into either camp. It really depends on the issue. But I was just wondering what you think about concerns regarding like AI, and the big thing where Robert and I were possibly disagreeing was if like Neuralink is a good thing, and I think it would be a good thing for certain conditions like disabilities and whatnot. But I'm not sure it would be good as a form of like human augmentation beyond that, because if we get into that, how do you know what part is like the person versus the machine? Is the machine taking over the person? Are we creating like p zombies, like philosophical zombies, and they're just, and we think they're alive in there, but it's really like the robot talking, or this is a kind of thing I was concerned about, and more less on the like cybernetic front. Just once things like ChatGPT and LLMs get more advanced, like, shouldn't there be like some sort of watermark or some like legal requirement that like it has to announce itself as like an AI, so that you know whether you're talking to an actual person or you're talking to a machine? Because if you think you're talking to a person, and it can trick you and have misaligned incentives, or it could be set after you by another person, like another agent or actor, and it's not just the AI going rogue, but some whoever's running the AI has gone rogue. Like, how do we correct for like, or mitigate the risks regarding AI? I think there's a lot of like risks, and I don't think they're all like the Hollywood nature of like Terminator or iRobot. I think it's more on the line of like incompetence, or like doing something by mistake. Like we just don't know what the neural link is actually functioning like once it's in someone's head. It's not that some scientist or technologist literally tried to make people into pea zombies. It was just a like something that happened. You know, what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, this is a great topic. I love thinking about this stuff. Yeah, like transhumanism and all of that.
Yeah,
Um,
transhumanism really concerns me a little, quite a
yeah,
bit.
me too. Me too. I mean, hearkening back a little bit to what you mentioned about depersonalization, derealization. um,
Yeah,
I see that getting worse and worse the more people spend time glued to their phones and glued to screens. And if you mainline a computer into the brain and hook it up to the internet and hook it up to an AI assistant and all of that, it's going to bring the human more and more and more into something called the astral. I mean, there's a lot of terms you can have for this, but it's like the mind, and it's the disembodied and the disassociation world. and and that I think is a problem, and I think that actually adds to a lot of health issues as well. My health benefits a lot from me spending time in my body, and I actually have to really attempt to do this often because I can get way up into my head too much and kind of expansive and out into this kind of visionary world, and also can spend way too much time on the phone and social media. And so getting into my body and breathing in my body, going out into the sun, doing qigong, working out, doing steel mace flow, and again, it's all that stuff's hard for me because of chronic fatigue, but I still do it, and I have to do it. And getting my bare feet grounded on the earth, spending time in nature, spending time at the river, these are all things that I find so healing and so important to me. Connecting to nature, so important. And and so yeah, like, I've watched some interviews with Elon Musk and whatnot, and watching him, or listening to him talking about basically like the whole goal with Neuralink is to take everything that we're doing with AI and with cell phones and social media and just reduce the bandwidth, right? Like reduce the bit, or increase the bit rate in the megabyte transfer rate, and reduce the bandwidth, and or sorry, increase the bandwidth so that there's no latency, right? And so it's kind of
yeah,
crazy to think to be able to like interact in real time with this kind of internet thing and the AI and large language models and all of that. And I was just thinking about it today because I use Chat GPT all the time, and I was just thinking about how if it was even easier for me to use it, I would probably, because I actually have OCD and I'm kind of obsessive about stuff. If I'm not careful, I'm thought looping and I'm thinking all the time. I could like imagine if I could just ask it any question I wanted and received an answer immediately, just in my brain, I would probably be functioning in my brain and thoughts all of the time and just constantly asking things, and you know, and then
it would worsen the neurosis. It wouldn't improve it. Yeah, that's what I
yeah,
would be concerned about.
it could
Yeah,
potentially worsen the neurosis, not improve it. It could also atrophy the part of my brain that is making sense of the world without this thing, perhaps that's, potential.
yeah. And I just when Elon says something like, "Oh, well," like I'm sure you've heard him say this on Rogan and other places where he'll say, "We'll be able to communicate without talking." Like, why
Yeah.
is that even desirable? Like where does he get the assumption that that's like a net positive or somehow better? Like, do you really want people to be able to read your thoughts? Or you can choose to decide which thoughts you're sharing and you're not. But what if you get hacked? Yeah, I'm sure you could have an hour conversation in like 1 second and it would make everything more efficient. But like I can't see that being like in every domain, like a pod. Like, are you still experiencing the dopamine and the serotonin and all the different things you experience during the conversation? Are you still experiencing the conversation, or are you just downloading it after the fact? Like, how? Like, are you still alive? Like, what do you mean we're communicating when we're not having a conversation. Like I don't even know what that really entails. So how can I say that's a good thing or a bad thing? Like it just seems like a huge leap, like logically that would be good.
Yeah. So I'm I'm all for experimentation and, human rights and freedom of choice and all of that. And so if there's a subsect of the population that wants to experiment with those things, uh, it's an interesting experiment, and then we get to see what it's like. Um, yeah, yeah, some of the more or some of the interesting conversations with transhumanism is like wealth inequality and like a disparity between folks who are going to have access to all of this stuff and what kind of competitive advantage wealthy people who can do all these transhumanistic things to their bodies
Yeah.
and minds, like what kind of competitive advantage are they going to have? Are they going to just be able to increase more and more wealth and power? Are they going to leave the rest of us behind? Are they going to,
Yeah, that's why I don't see it purely as just a freedom thing, like choosing to take psychedelic, because it's not like once you introduce this technology, it will inevitably like lead to multipolar traps. Because if you don't
precisely, yeah, arms
if
races, yeah,
you
go on.
if you don't join the team, then you're gonna be like a chicken compared to this next level that's able to outsmart you like 100 times or 1,000 times. It might not be that significant, but even if it's 3 times, that's still gonna be significant enough that it's gonna produce huge inequalities and yeah, I don't know. I'm more positive about some technology, although it can be misused, of course, as well. But things like I would be more on board with somebody augmenting themselves biologically through things like CRISPR than like having like robotic parts in them, unless it was to like treat a condition. Like if your arm no longer worked and you needed a robotic arm, or if you needed an implant to like communicate to your spinal cord so you could walk. I'm all on board with that. But if the implant you're getting is allowing you to compute, like do mental computation at like a million times the rate and do all this stuff, and you're not even really human anymore, you're something else, whatever that is. I don't know if that is like if we're actually creating a better life form, or we're actually causing more suffering and we just don't know it. Or yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, we'll have to see. Um, the conversations around arms races, multipolar traps, race to the bottom dynamics, and game theoretic dynamics, that kind of stuff I'm really interested in. Um, yeah, where there's a zero sum game, where there's the kind of competition that people are trying to outdo one another instead of working cooperatively with one another. And that's, yeah, in the sphere of transhumanism and AI and stuff, that's really fascinating. I mean, we're already seeing that with AI. It's like all company. It's just like a race to the bottom with companies trying to implement it across all different sectors and using it for different solutions in their business because in order to stay competitive, they have to do that. And then they're also laying off employees and replacing AI with that too, which is definitely an issue. Um, yeah, there's the whole like issue with technology replacing jobs. Like that's it's I don't see it as being an issue as long as folks are actually um, as long as there's political measures that are taken in order to support the change. I think it could be a good thing. Um, but that's where conversations like universal basic income come in, which is then a super highly debatable topic. And like if we're going to use technology to automate all of these jobs and then there's a big layoff of millions of jobs, how are people going to survive, right? How are people going to support themselves? How are they going to make money? That's an interesting conversation.
Yeah, I think in that area, well, maybe some new jobs will be created, but I think for a long time anyway, in that area, I'm less concerned because I think most AI jobs will you'll just have like an assistant AI to augment your working ability. So if you're like a radiologist or something, you're gonna have an AI that helps you diagnose things faster, but it's not gonna get rid of you completely. But I'm more concerned with like I guess AI tricking people or like a super intelligence having some misalignment, or in the
Yeah,
case we were
misalignment and
already
stuff.
talking about
Yeah.
like the merging is like would you share this I don't know view that something like CRISPR, although it would still have potential downfall. Like who knows? But if you knew somebody was going to be augmented to be smarter, more athletic, or better looking, or whatever you're doing with CRISPR, would you? I'm not saying it's a good or bad, but would you not rather have that person than a person that has like a literal like robot in their head and like can like do like it's taking things to a whole like don't you think that is something we have to be like a little bit more cautious with than other
Yeah.
technology?
I
Yeah,
mean, things like yeah, things so like biological engineering, like CRISPR, right? So, and CRISPR is something that you like. This is something that people would do to their babies or their children or in utero. When does the gene editing happen? And can you use CRISPR to edit genes in an adult? I actually don't
yeah.
know.
Theoretically you could, at least some. I mean, we're not there yet, but the one of the applications is to edit out disease in people that are adults as
Yeah,
well. Like
I would love
it's not.
that.
Yeah. So I think the use of CRISPR isn't just like the shallow designer baby stuff. Like that's can get murky and weird. But there are legitimate benefits for people that aren't born yet and people that are already born and later in life. It's just very new. I'm not in touch with all the research there, but someone like Jennifer Doudna, who's like a biochemist who's very famous and really one of the pioneers of CRISPR. She would be someone to touch on that. I actually have not much of a clue, but I know it's not limited to just, oh, I want my kid to have blue eyes, or I want him
Yeah.
to have an IQ of 150,
Well,
or whatever it is. It's
I mean,
it's
yeah,
yeah.
there's that stuff which is like the more superficial stuff, and then there's like, I mean, I think I had read that they could do genetic testing like in utero and see, or when they're first born, and see like the likelihood that they're going to develop certain diseases, and if it seems high given the genetic coding, then they would put CRISPR in to
Like you
interact.
can edit out the ACTG kind
Yeah,
of stuff is what I'm saying. Like you could do that before, so it doesn't even develop if you caught it early. Yeah,
yeah, that's one of the bigger applications, I think.
more
Um,
important. Yeah,
yeah. But yeah, as far as like putting the technology in the brain,
that
uh,
stuff just that's just stuff scares me. Like it's
yeah,
not
because
like
there's so many. Go on, but there's so many risks, like as you're saying, like, and there's so many bad actors out there. It's like Philip K. Dick or something story where like you wake up and you have like your black, or it's like when you're sleeping, you're being programmed with like wanting different products or something. It's like what's to stop that from happening? Like the market incentive is so strong to do something like that. And there's so many bad actors out there. It's like, you know what I mean? To just hack people's like brain implant and use it for capitalism. To of course they're going to do that. Just like hypnotically pump in their like product or something while they're sleeping, so they wake up and
yeah,
they're like, yeah, I really want this specific product. That there's so much risk there for all of that.
yeah, and then it gets even further. Are we going to end up building simulations? I don't know if that's. I guess if the
We're going to end up
simulations
with
are very good, but like I
there's
just
already
have
that
this.
with VR, right?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's very rudimentary still, but
Yeah.
But I mean, if we actually have like where we're living primarily in another world that's digital,
A
I don't,
metaverse.
yeah, I don't think that would be a good thing. I think
No, not at all.
um
It's gonna lead to
and
it'll lead to more and more illness in the body. I mean, we live in bodies, we have to tend to these bodies. We have to move the bodies, we have to connect with the earth, we have to connect with the sun, we have to connect with one another in real life. We can't just exist in that world and expect to be healthy, in my opinion.
yeah, and what about the people that say we can upload consciousness? Like we don't even know what consciousness is yet.
Yeah,
How I don't.
how it functions, and it
Yeah,
needs a body to function, doesn't I mean, it's how do you yeah. I mean, I find that stuff interesting. There's that TV show, I forgot the name of it. But it's like a sci-fi TV show. I think it's on Netflix, and they upload the consciousness in the body to like a disc, right? And the body is just this kind of like husk that they can shed if they need to, and then they can, put the new disc in. And are you familiar with that show?
is it the one on Prime called Upload?
I don't think it's called Upload.
I've heard of that show. Um,
I
but
mean,
no,
it's a pretty common sci-fi trope, anyways. But yeah, that is, I mean, it's an interesting thought to, you know, will we ever get to the point where we can transfer consciousness to some kind of hardware and install it into a body, wetware, right? And have that consciousness actually transfer in between bodies, in between lifetimes. Yeah, we would have to understand what consciousness is. We could think about that or talk about that. That's fun.
yeah. What's your ontology and epistemology on that? Anyway, like, what do you think consciousness and phenomenology even is? Like, do you think it's just connected to brains, or like, are you idealist? Are you materialist? Are you uh, panpsychist? Like, where do you fall on the spectrum of?
Yeah, I've been thinking about this, and I listened to some philosophers, and I think Bernardo Kastrup? He's
Yeah,
panpsychist, and
he's an idealist, I think.
he's an idealist. Yeah,
Yeah, metaphysical idealism is what he thinks.
you'd have to parse that out for me a bit more,
So
but
metaphysical idealism is the concept. I might butcher it, but I'll try not to. But it's the concept in which that consciousness is primary and the
right,
physical is like a byproduct of consciousness, or it's like the icons on like a computer, but it's not what everything is.
yeah, I'm
It
familiar.
looks,
Yeah,
yeah, that kind of stuff. Like um, the icon concept is more from Donald Hoffman, I believe, not Bernard Kastrup. But I mean, they basically think the same thing. So I'm just using what came to mind first. But basically, consciousness is primary and physical is secondary. Materialism is the concept in which the physical is primary and consciousness is arises as a byproduct of certain physical processes, and then panpsychism is the idea that um, there, every unit of matter has a piece of something like qualia, they call it, which is like a unit of consciousness, you could say. And then when you organize it in a certain way, only then do you get complex consciousness. And then there's people like, I forget his last name, but it's Christopher or Christoph something. He would be a IIT. It's like integrated information theory,
oh,
I
right,
think.
right.
That's a whole other theory of consciousness, but I'm not super familiar with it, so I can't really break that one down.
Yeah,
But
I've,
those are
I've,
all the theories that I'm aware of. Go ahead.
yeah, yeah, I've read a little bit about that theory as well, but I haven't gone super deep into it. Um, yeah, it's interesting because like I'll just start by saying like I don't know. I have no idea. I don't think anybody does.
Yeah, well, no, no, no.
Yeah,
It's pure intuition, and then
yeah,
we'll have your motivated reasoning on that in one direction or another, but it's
Yeah.
really hard to not have a bias in that. But
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, my bias is towards matter being unconscious until it evolves through levels of complexity into forming biological structures that have brains, that have nervous systems, and there are biological structures that don't have brains and nervous systems but still have some level of consciousness. But yeah, I'm of the like, matter has emerged through time and space over billions of years and increased in complexity, and it's needed to make sense of the world as biological matter came into life, came into existence, and needing to sense the surroundings is what needing to do things like find food, like find glucose in the surroundings, uh, at a very early stage of development, cellular life into multicellular, like its needs to move throughout the environment is what has brought about this kind of cognitive, well, cognitive insinuates a brain. There wasn't always a brain, but bringing about this kind of processing, this like external processing, and that's what I would say consciousness is. It's like it's externally processing data in the exterior world, that's salient and important to the sustaining of the body
so you
itself.
would say that consciousness has an evolutionary purpose. It's not just an epiphenomenon of biological processes. It's not just a byproduct, but it's actually
Oh,
evolutionarily
absolutely. Yeah.
evolved. Okay.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
both. I think it's both. I mean, it's both, but it absolutely has an evolutionary purpose, because the more intelligent beings have gotten with consciousness, the more likely they are to survive and adapt and procreate and continue, evolving, in terms of fitness and whatnot.
Yeah. But is that like presupposing free will? Because I'm not sure if
Yeah,
free
we can talk
will
about that.
exists.
So what's that? Free will
What?
is like free. Well, yeah, we could go into free will. It's fun. That's always a fun conversation too. But yeah, go on.
Well, I'm just saying if you think consciousness has a role
Yeah.
evolutionarily, then you are presupposing free will, right? Or not?
I I think there's kind of like a multi levels to free will, where on some levels there's not free will, and on some there is.
I agree. I
Yeah,
agree.
yeah,
Do
yeah.
you want
Free
to
will.
get into that, or is that too? Like, I do want to wrap up at some point. I don't want to go too long, but we can definitely do like a part two to this sometime if you want. But is there any areas you want to go down before we wrap up? I still do have some time. If you want to talk about any of the stuff that I opened with, whether it was woke versus anti woke, or whether it's ableism or whatever. I know we got into like some health issues, but we didn't break down like different theories of like different thing. Do you want to do that, or do you want to save that for like another time?
Um, I think we could have like a little more fun on the free will thing, and then we could go into, yeah, maybe like one more topic. Yeah.
Okay. So to give your thoughts on free will. Let's do that.
Well,
Let's
yeah,
do that.
because when I think about free will, I'm not so much paying attention to other philosophers as I am sitting with my own personal experience and analyzing my own consciousness and how I function. And so I like to start that thought experiment by being in meditation, which I think requires free will, requires self discipline. It requires sitting and observing observing my thoughts, observing my body, observing my breath, noticing what arises. And I feel like free will exists in the pause and in the gap between reactivity to my environment and the external, to things people might say, or even reactivity to thoughts in my own mind or emotions in my body, it exists in the pause between that, where I can have some kind of like animalistic instinctual reaction or some habitual emotional reaction or something that is more autopilot, or I can have a relationship where I'm noticing, observing, kind of tracking, noticing different parts in my being, different parts of my psyche, different parts emotionally. I'm kind of like tracking and holding all of these different things and then noticing maybe urges and then saying like, and like curbing the urge to react. Well, in that curbing of the urge, I'm inserting some kind of will to do that. If I'm just operating on autopilot and operating in this like limbic reactionary emotional way, or this kind of unconscious way to myself and the world around me, there's not a whole lot of free will in there. So I would say this might be some kind of like hierarchical or egotistical way of looking at it. I don't know if this is true. I'm open to exploring it. I think there's a chance that a lot of people don't have free will, or not very much, because they're operating on autopilot, because they're not.
Well, I just want to
Loving.
clarify terms a little bit. So when
Yeah.
I say free will, I don't mean the distinction between conscious and subconscious behavior. And when I say uh, free will, I'm not talking about will. I'm talking, is the will free? I'm not denying the
Okay.
existence
So
of will.
yeah, and so that would be like the from a non-dual perspective, um, in a lot of like Eastern philosophy, maybe Vedanta or something. There's the idea that we're kind of like actors, where there's this sort of like predeterminism, and
Mhm.
from our perspective, it seems like there's free will, but really there's not, because we're just kind of actors on this like cosmological divine stage, and there's like these like predetermined forces that are, so you could say maybe it's God or divine or something, and it's like it's what's it's the thing that's creating everything. Is that what you're kind of getting at?
Yeah,
Or
or it doesn't have to be divine. It could be a purely materialist, like determinist physics, whether
determinist
classical
physics?
mechanics or
Exactly.
quantum
Yeah.
mechanics could be
I
that.
think that's
Like,
kind of
have you heard the debates around free will? Like the main people that talk about it are probably like Sam Harris, Dan Dennett, and
yeah.
what Robert Sapolsky, is that
Yep.
how you say his name? I think so.
Yeah.
Um, they talk about free will a lot and have somewhat differing opinions. Especially Dan Dennett he would call himself a compatibilist. He doesn't think like real free will exists, but he thinks like we can essentially call voluntary action free will, which is a fair argument. But then Sam Harris would say there's something different between voluntary action and true free will, and there should be a distinction. And there's no free will. There's just voluntary versus involuntary action. But
I would be
whatever.
really interesting. Yeah, I'd be interested to know like what the exact specifics are that he's parsing between those two terminology, and like why voluntary action can't be called free will, and maybe it is the deterministic, mechanistic, scientific, materialist worldview that's, maybe it's this cause and effect sort of causal chain that he's pulling on, like the
Yeah, I think that's what he's pulling
kill,
up when
kill
you're talking
yourself.
about Sam.
What's
Yeah,
that?
when you're talking about Sam Harris, that's what his base assumption is materialism. Yeah,
Materialism and causality, and maybe like a
yeah,
billiard ball
cause and
theory.
effect universe. Yeah.
Yeah, cause and effect. I don't know, man. I've had some really interesting experiences where like, for example, I'm not sure that time is linear given some experiences I've had. I I've had dreams, one dream in particular, where I dreamed that a friend of mine, who wasn't even that close of a friend, I dreamed that she broke her ankle. And 3 days later on social media, she shared that she broke her ankle that day.
Mm-hmm.
Again, of course, it's just anecdotal, But
course. Yeah.
after I
So
had that experience, I had I was like, "Wait, I'm not sure that time is causal in the sense that it's super linear. There might be some kind of thing where events kind of ripple out in all directions, back and forward in time. It'd be interesting to explore that. I think there's some like what's it, pair anomalies research lab that might look into that kind of stuff. I'd love to explore it more. Um, but yeah, in quantum computing, they're showing that too. Like, have you heard of quantum computers that can like watch a movie from um, it's like retro causality. They can watch a movie from forwards to, or from like the end of it to the beginning.
I
Or
never
they,
knew that about quantum computers, but I've heard of the concept in quantum mechanics. Not that I'm an expert or anything, I'm not at all, but I've heard of the concept of retrocausality. And also, there's also a concept of like block universe, so that like every moment in time is equally real as the time you're experiencing right now, but the present is kind of like an illusion, but there like you being born and you being a 9-year-old man are equally happening all at once. There's that's block universe, so that's a very strange, hard
that,
way to grasp, but there's that as well.
that's an
I find that
interesting.
very interesting.
Yeah, yeah. Time is interesting. I've spent like not enough not enough time studying time, but I think there's like a scientific uh, publishing group, or it's like a journal. It's called Chronos, I think.
Yeah,
Um,
this is Sabina Hofstetter, right? Is she's part of that or no?
I don't remember her specific name, but I just remember coming across it and being like, "Wow, that's something I need to dive into more," and then haven't.
Yeah. All right. Well, do you want to wrap up with that, or do you want to?
Hmm. I'm trying to think. Is there anything else that feels like present, or like with what you know about me and yeah, what I'm interested in? And is there anything else?
Not that comes to mind at the moment, but maybe I'm just running low on brain energy right now. I don't know tons about you. I just know what we've talked about before. So, but the more we talk, the more I will learn about you, and the more I pay attention to what you're doing. I'll definitely figure some stuff out for our next conversations for sure. I very
Cool.
much enjoyed our chat,